Reaction now with Dalia Kaye. She's Senior Fellow at the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations. She joins us live from Los Angeles. And Dalia, what's your view on the status of negotiations as it stands? It does seem like we are closer to a deal than ever before, but there have been real problems with these talks over the last few months. What are the issues outstanding and how close are we to a deal?
Yeah, well, I think the general consensus is we are much closer, certainly than we were close to a year and a half ago when these negotiations in Vienna started to revive the agreement. But there are serious sticking points. There's questions about the terms of sanctions relief. There's an issue of an ongoing IAEA probe. There is also the question from the Iranian side of whether there can be guarantees that the U.S. won't withdraw again, and whether the Europeans can bridge some of those gaps to provide assurances to the Iranians that they won't make these nuclear rollbacks and not get sanctions relief in return. So there are serious sticking points. The IRGC issue seems to be off the table, which is good news. And the scale and pace of negotiations has really sped up, and the EU proposal has presented what looks like a decision point, and now it's basically sitting in Washington to decide on what their response will be.
Dalia, we regularly speak with policymakers in the Middle East, in this part of the world where I'm speaking to you from now. And the question that I have is, will an Iran nuclear deal make the region safer? It's interesting because you've also warned of possible crises that could emerge if we do see this deal taking place, including not just regional reactions, but other factors as well. Could you expand on that?
Absolutely. Well, I think first it's important to note that it would be an important gain to get the nuclear deal back in place. It's important to get nuclear constraints back on Iran. Since the Trump administration left the deal in 2018, the status quo is incredibly dangerous right now. Iran is enriching uranium to 60%, very close to the level you need to make nuclear weapons if they decide to do so. Military escalation in the region has increased. Iran has lashed out. So we're in a very serious point. So it is important to get that back in the box, the nuclear program. And so this agreement would be a significant gain. But it absolutely is not a silver bullet. And I think we need to set realistic expectations about what will follow, even if we get this revived agreement. I think there's a couple of flashpoints we should look at. One is there's going to be likely a staged implementation process. This was the case in 2015. The deal was not adopted overnight. It went over several months, and it was 6 months until implementation. Lots of crises can emerge during that period. Back in 2015, there was a direct line of communication between the U.S. and Iran. We do not have that today. In the past, that helped diffuse crises. We would have to depend on our allies to do that. And I think the other big wild card is the regional reaction. And you mentioned how, the neighborhood is looking at this, and they're very nervous about Iran, not because only of their nuclear program, but of course their regional activities, particularly support for proxies and their precision guided missile development and drones. So I think that's going to be a big focus in the neighborhood should this deal move forward.
Dalia, the other interesting aspect to this is how it's being viewed domestically in the United States. And I think you're well placed to give us some insight on that as well. In my view, this does not necessarily seem like a top foreign policy priority for the Biden administration as it stands, particularly in the early days of this administration, which was really focused in on managing COVID. And now the key priority is managing inflation and the war in Ukraine. Where does Iran stand as a domestic agenda stateside?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, actually, in terms of the Middle East, getting the Iran deal back was actually a high priority for the Biden administration. It was a stated high priority. Of course, the Middle East was considered less critical than focusing on China and other pressing issues, as you said, like COVID, socioeconomic pressures in this country. But getting the nuclear deal back was a very, very high priority for the Biden administration. They would like to see a return to the deal. They didn't rush into it. There was a lot of consultations. The Iranians dragged their feet. It took a while to get to this point. But I think there is a desire. And I would say the Ukraine war, on one hand, complicated things a little bit because it's increased great power tensions, of course, although all seem to still support the return to the deal, even Russia. But there has been a renewed pressure or interest in increasing oil supply. And in that sense, the domestic tables could have turned a bit. There'll still be significant resistance, especially from the Republican Party. They will unanimously oppose this. But because of the interest in getting a little bit of relief in this very tight oil market in the wake of the Ukraine war, I think there'll be a lot of interest in seeing Iranian oil back on the market. At least this will help our European allies in particular. So, dynamics are working both ways, but I think there's still incentives to get this back. And it's also not just an American problem, it's a global crisis. So we have to keep that in mind as well.